Close your eyes for 1 second, actually do it. Behind your closed eyelids, most people see something, a faint grid, a web of lines, maybe a spiral drifting at the edge of the dark. You've probably had that happen 1,000 times and never once asked why an eye that sees nothing keeps generating a shape. There's a short list of shapes the human mind keeps producing under altered perception, the same handful of families in people who never spoke to each other across nearly a century of documented research. And almost nobody realizes those familiar shapes may all trace back to a fifth one that isn't supposed to be there at all. If you think that's just static behind your eyes, wait until you hear what happened on the 24th night I traced one of those shapes on purpose. When it stopped fading the way it had for 23 nights straight, the ambient hum of the room simply stopped, and for a few seconds my own voice didn't answer me. What is that shape, really? Why does a 2,000-year-old Greek geometry text call it exact instead of beautiful? And why does an Egyptian scribal text describe the same discipline as geography? To understand what happened on night 24, we need to go back to where this pattern was first documented, not by mystics, but by scientists. Right now, before any of that, notice the space about an inch above the crown of your head. Don't touch it. Just notice if there's anything there. Warmth, pressure, nothing at all. Hold that. We're coming back to it. In 1928, a psychologist named Heinrich Klüver did something almost nobody had done before him. He asked people to describe in detail the shapes they saw during altered perception, and then he sorted the descriptions. What he found wasn't chaos. It was 4 repeating families of pattern, a lattice or honeycomb grid, a web, a tunnel, a spiral, showing up over and over in people who had never spoken to each other, in states that had nothing else in common. Decades later, researcher Ronald K. Siegel documented the same 4 families in completely unrelated conditions: near-death experience, sensory deprivation, and ordinary hypnagogic drifting at the edge of sleep. That's not folklore. That's close to a century of documented perception research converging on the same short list of shapes. I didn't read Klüver's research before I saw anything. I read it after, when I went looking for an explanation for what had been happening to me for 23 nights running, every night at the same hour, lying still with my eyes closed, watching a shape that kept refusing to hold together. I want to walk you through those 23 nights honestly, because the pattern you're about to hear about doesn't arrive on night 1. It barely arrives at all for a long time. That's part of the point. Here's the system I want you holding on to for the rest of this video. Lattice, web, tunnel, spiral. 4 families, documented, repeating, older than any of the specific traditions I'm about to bring in. If you've ever pressed on closed eyelids and watched a honeycomb grid crawl across the dark, that's lattice. If you've ever had a fever and watched threads connect into something like a net, that's web. Tunnel and spiral tend to show up together, most often reported right at the edge of sleep, or in the accounts of people describing near-death experience, a sense of movement through a narrowing shape or a round one. What I traced above my own head for 30 nights falls into the lattice family, a grid of fine lines, but it didn't start as a grid. It started as 2 overlapping circles. And what's strange is that the 2-circle shape isn't in Klüver's 4 families at all. It's a 5th thing, a generator shape, something that produces the other 4 rather than sitting alongside them. And by the end of this video, I think you'll understand why that distinction actually matters. For now, hold this question: what does it mean that a shape science can name and sort still has an origin nobody in that research fully explains? I'll come back to that. The shape I traced is called the Vesica Trace, 2 circles of the same size, overlapping until the space between them forms an almond. The Pythagoreans didn't call it decoration, they called it exact. It's the geometric construction that produces the circle, the equilateral triangle, and the square root of 3, with no approximation involved. Plato took that kind of precision seriously enough to build a cosmology on it. In the Timaeus, he assigns 4 of the 5 regular solids to the classical elements: fire to the tetrahedron, earth to the cube, air to the octahedron, water to the icosahedron, and describes the 5th, the dodecahedron, as what the divine used to arrange the constellations across the whole heaven. According to Francis Cornford's standard academic translation of the text, that's not poetic flourish. That's Plato treating geometric form as the literal scaffolding of the physical universe. The oldest surviving text that puts Thoth's own name in the role of teacher isn't full of prophecy the way people expect. It's the Demotic Book of Thoth, preserved across more than 40 fragmentary papyri, and it's full of measurement, sacred geography, taught scribe to student. Most readings treat that phrase as religious cartography, temple maps, river directions. My reading is different. I don't think that geography was ever only about land, and by the end of this video, I'll tell you exactly why I think that. And there's a third data point, one that has nothing to do with belief. The Great Pyramid's original estimated height, about 146.6 meters, against its base, about 230.4 meters, lands within centimeters of both pi and phi, the golden ratio. Most Egyptologists favor the explanation that the builders used a practical unit called the sisegt, and that the match to pi and phi is a mathematical byproduct, not a declared intention. And I think that reading deserves as much respect as the more exciting one. What isn't debatable is the measurement itself. 3 completely different sources, Greek philosophy, Egyptian scribal instruction, and a structure built out of stone, keep landing on the same handful of exact geometric relationships. Historian Garth Fowden, in his academic study, The Egyptian Hermes, traces Thoth's core function across Egyptian religion back to exactly this: measurement, scribal office, the god who records and calibrates rather than simply pronounces. That's worth sitting with for a second. The tradition didn't hand Thoth a title like God of Secrets or God of Prophecy first. It handed him a measuring rod. Everything mystical that got layered on top of him in later centuries sits on top of that original, unglamorous job description. And there's a scholar who treats this material as more than folklore worth decorating a book cover with. Robert Lawlor's Sacred Geometry, Philosophy and Practice is not a coloring guide. It treats geometric proportion, golden ratios, the quadrature of the circle, the Vesica itself, as a cosmological language, the same claim the Egyptian material makes in ritual language instead of academic language. Lawlor's work is where I first connected the Vesica to a much older phrase, the one carved into the Hermetic tradition's own foundation, as above, so below. That line isn't decoration either. It's the specific claim that sacred geometry makes visible, the same pattern repeating from the body to the cosmos, not as metaphor, but as structure. Here's what I actually did starting 24 nights ago, 30 nights total when the practice finishes. Same time, every night. Lying down, eyes closed, breathing slow for a few minutes before starting anything. Then visualizing, in the space just above the crown of my head, the same spot I asked you to notice earlier, 2 circles of equal size beginning to overlap slowly until the almond shape closes between them. For the first stretch of nights, almost nothing happened that I'd call remarkable. The shape would appear faint and unstable, fading out after a few seconds, usually paired with a light pressure at the crown that came and went without warning. Some nights I couldn't even hold the 2 circles steady long enough for them to overlap at all. I kept going anyway, mostly out of stubbornness. Around night 10, a new layer showed up that had no obvious connection to the visualization at all. A light tingling in both hands, faint at first, then unmistakable, arriving alongside the shape with no explanation I could construct for it. I didn't force a meaning onto that. I just noted it, wrote it down the next morning, and kept the practice exactly the same. Around night 18, the shape started holding longer before it faded, and the pressure at the crown began to persist for a few minutes after each session ended. Instead of stopping the second I opened my eyes. That's the honest arc, not a straight line towards something dramatic, but layer after layer, each one slightly different from the one before it. Most of them small enough that I could have talked myself out of noticing them if I'd wanted to. There were nights in between where I almost stopped, somewhere around night 15, lying there with a faint grid barely holding together for the fourth night running. I remember thinking that 23 nights of near nothing was exactly the kind of thing a person keeps doing out of pride, not evidence that I was one long exercise in not admitting a practice wasn't working. I kept going anyway, mostly because the tingling in my hands and the persisting pressure at the crown weren't nothing, even if the visual itself was underwhelming. Something was accumulating even when nothing was visibly happening, and I decided to trust the accumulation over the boredom. Then came night 24. In the middle of the overlap, the shape didn't fade the way it had for 23 nights running. It expanded, first filling my entire closed field of vision, then, for one exact moment, overlapping with my perception of the room itself, like a fine lattice of light laid over the ordinary darkness. In that same instant, the low ambient hum of the room, the one I genuinely never noticed until it was gone, simply stopped, not faded, stopped. And for a few seconds after that, when I tried to say something out loud, my voice didn't answer the way it always had before. Not fear closing my throat, something closer to the mechanism itself not responding on schedule. I'm going to come back to exactly what that was with the reading I've since put on it. But I need to build the rest of the case first, because that reading doesn't hold up without it. The lattice I saw belongs to a shape the modern spiritual marketplace calls Metatron Cube, 13 circles from the flower of life, connected by straight lines, containing all 5 of Plato's solids. Drunvalo Melchizedek gave it that name in his 1999 book, The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. Metatron itself comes from an older Jewish tradition, an archangel scribe named in the Talmud, but pinning that name to this specific diagram is a 20th century move, not an ancient one. Worth saying plainly, because separating the two is exactly what makes either one trustworthy. The Merkaba meditation that usually travels alongside it, a spinning star of light around the body, isn't something I practice during these 30 nights. I name it only because you'll run into it within minutes of researching this territory, and I'd rather say so than let you assume I borrowed from it quietly. One philosopher gets a single sentence here because he earns it without needing more. Iamblichus, writing in on the mysteries, defended theurgy, ritual practice using forms and symbols to elevate the practitioner toward the divine as legitimate initiatory work, not superstition to be embarrassed about. I mention him because what I was doing for 30 nights sits closer to his category than to a wellness routine. Now here's where I want to be careful, because this is the part where sacred geometry content usually goes wrong. In 1980, the physicist David Bohm, a theoretical physicist who had collaborated with Einstein, published Wholeness and the Implicate Order, proposing that reality has a folded, undivided order underneath it, an implicate order from which the separate, visible forms we actually perceive, the explicate order, unfold, the way a pattern unfolds from something more compressed than itself. Bohm does not say sacred geometry is real in any mystical sense. He proposes, as serious physics, that visible form unfolds from a deeper, unified order that isn't itself shaped the way the shapes we see are shaped. Quick question before I keep going, because I actually want the answer. If you've ever watched a pattern like this form on its own during meditation, not one you built on purpose, one that just arrived, tell me in the comments what shape it took. I read all of them, and I'm genuinely curious how common this is outside my own head. So here's the stack. Plato and the Pythagoreans describing the Vesica as the exact mathematical generator of basic form. The Demotic Book of Thoth describing sacred geography taught scribe to student. And Bohm describing visible form unfolding from an order that precedes it. Three fields: Greek geometry, Egyptian scribal religion, and late 20th century theoretical physics. None of them ever cited each other. None of them were built to agree. I know exactly what the skeptical part of you is doing with that list right now, lining up three names from three different centuries and asking whether stacking them next to each other actually proves anything at all. It doesn't on its own, and I'm not going to pretend it does. I'm not saying that because these three fields converge, one of them validates the other two, or that Bohm's physics somehow confirms an Egyptian ritual formula. I'm saying something more precise. Three traditions that never read each other's work keep independently arriving at the same open question: where does a shape actually come from before it becomes a shape you can see? That convergence doesn't answer the question. It just means the question is real and older and more serious than decoration with good energy. Most sacred geometry content treats these forms as decoration with good energy, something you wear, color in, or hang on a wall. My reading of Plato and the Pythagoreans suggests something else entirely. They didn't call the Vesica beautiful, they called it exact. If that's true, then tracing it every night for 30 nights isn't decorating your space, it's practicing something closer to the mechanism itself. And when I read in the Demotic Book of Thoth that Thoth teaches a discipline called sacred geography, I don't think that word was ever only pointed outward at temples and rivers. I think part of it was always pointed inward, which means tracing a shape above your own head night after night isn't imitating an old Egyptian symbol. It's attempting in the body the same act of measurement the text describes happening between a teacher and a student. That's my actual thesis, and I want to state it plainly instead of hiding it in atmosphere. Sacred geometry doesn't heal you, and it doesn't unlock some hidden power. What it does, the only thing I'm actually claiming, is sit in the one place where ancient ritual language and modern physics end up describing, almost word for word, the same unanswered question. 30 nights of tracing were never about learning to look at a pattern. They were about getting slowly closer to wherever the pattern originates. And when that actually happens, even for a second, it doesn't inspire you the way people expect. It silences you. So here's exactly what I did if you want to try a version of it yourself. I'm calling this the Vesica Trace, and I want to be completely upfront about what it is and isn't. This is not a reconstruction of any documented temple ritual. It's a method I built myself, inspired by the Vesica the Pythagoreans described with mathematical precision, and by a single phrase in the Demotic Book of Thoth about sacred geography that I don't think was ever only about land. It's mine. I'm not claiming Thoth handed it down. Same time, every night. Sit or lie down, eyes closed, and breathe slowly for a few minutes before you start anything else. Don't skip that part. It matters more than it looks like it does. Then, in the space just above the crown of your head, visualize two circles of the same size beginning to overlap slowly until the almond-shaped space closes between them. While that's happening, notice where the sensation concentrates. For most people, and for me, that's a light pressure or a faint tingling at the crown. Don't force anything past that. If the shape expands on its own, rotates, or multiplies without your effort, just observe it. Don't try to steer it or rush it. And if nothing happens on a given night, end the session without treating that as failure. The discipline is the act of showing up, not the result you get from showing up. Before you sleep, move your hands and feet slightly. Take one deliberate deep breath and consciously bring your attention back to your body and the room around you. That closing step isn't optional either. It's how you finish the cycle instead of leaving it half open. I'll tell you exactly why that matters in a moment when I get to what happened on night 24 because the one thing I changed on that specific night was refusing to skip straight to opening my eyes the second something felt unfamiliar. Every previous time in my life that something like this had started to happen, my first reflex was to open my eyes immediately and end it. On night 24, I didn't. I stayed with the shape until it receded on its own, and only then slowly tested whether my voice still worked. Here's the test I'd actually teach you, the one that took me 23 nights to learn the hard way. If you have to force the shape to appear, that's imagination, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not the thing I'm describing here. If you stay still and it completes itself on its own past the point where you were actively building it, that's the difference worth learning to notice. It's the difference between decorating a visualization and actually practicing something. There's something nobody talking about sacred geometry as decoration is willing to connect. If Bohm is right, that visible form unfolds from a deeper, undivided order, then treating that geometry as a pretty symbol is domesticating something that, encountered for real, has no obligation to be comfortable. That thought bothers me in a useful way because it means what happened next wasn't an aesthetic experience. It was closer to touching, for 1 second, the place a form comes from before it becomes a form at all, and nothing about that place owes you calm. Which brings me back to night 24, because now you have everything you need to understand what I mean when I say it. For 23 nights, I was building the shape, effort in, faint result out, every single time. On night 24, in the middle of the overlap, it stopped behaving like something I was making. It completed itself, past the point where my concentration was doing the work, expanding to fill my closed field of vision, then briefly overlapping with the actual room, a lattice of fine light laid over ordinary darkness. And in that same instant, the ambient hum of the room stopped, not faded, and for a few seconds, my own voice didn't answer when I tried to use it. I want to be honest about what I don't know, instead of dressing it up. I can't prove whether that shape completed itself because of 23 nights of sustained practice, or because something met it halfway, some organizing pattern that isn't reducible to effort. That's not a new question I'm inventing to make this sound bigger than it is. It's the same question ancient Egyptian ritual practice already asked about images and forms sustained by long, repeated attention, whether devotion given consistently enough to a pattern eventually meets something on the other side of it, or whether the pattern was always going to complete itself given enough nights of the same exact gesture. I don't have a clean answer. I'm holding both readings open on purpose because pretending I've resolved it would be its own kind of dishonesty. What I can say with more confidence is what it wasn't. It wasn't panic, there was fear in it, but a specific fear aimed at one exact thing, my voice not answering, not a general wave of dread. It wasn't intuition. Intuition is fast synthesis of things you already half know, and this was a total, sudden sensory event with no precedent to synthesize from. What it matched, closer than anything else, was a specific energetic signature, the same pressure at the crown that had been building for 18 nights, finally not fading on schedule, followed by a sense of that pressure moving slowly down through the body. In the same instant, the room went quiet. Whether something external met it halfway, I'm leaving that open. I'm not going to pretend the geometry handed me a clean answer to that question, because it didn't. What I do know is this: sacred geometry was never meant to be something you look at and feel calm about. It was meant to be traced night after night until it stops being a symbol you're holding and starts being something closer to the thing itself. I don't know yet whether the silence from night 24 comes back on the nights I have left, or what changes if it does, or if it doesn't. I'm still inside the 30, not finished with them. If you try tracing this yourself, type Vesica when you start. I read every one, and I want to know what night, if any, goes quiet for you, because right now I only have data on mine. Sacred geometry was never meant to be decoration. When it's real, it doesn't inspire you, it silences you.